I wanted to talk more about Genesis, the first book of the Bible. Each sentence of the first chapter of Genesis is referring to a long period of time where a major process is going on to create the planet. In fact, it goes all the way back to the origin of the sun and before the sun. So that means that the planet Earth did not even exist when the first sentences of Genesis are describing that history. Now, people look at it in the present state, the English translation, and you really can't just go by those words, because those words are mistranslated. They're not really telling you everything that was in the original source of Genesis. The original words, in fact, can be translated in several different ways, and they intended that because there's multiple meanings that are connected. They're interconnected. You got to understand that when they wrote this, they were initiates. That means they had wisdom. They were like beyond priests, beyond scientists. They knew so much, and they didn't want to write something that everyone would understand, because that would be too easy. They actually did something rather more complicated, and they got together multi-level writing of things that are going on, containing all this interwoven knowledge. The way that Hebrew is written in the Bible, it's like encoded, because every word has a meaning. You can't really take it out of context, and furthermore, they didn't even put the vowels in the right places. So the vowels give you extra meaning, and when you take them out and you just have consonants running into each other, you know, the letters that are consonants, they don't tell you everything. So you have to have a key. And the times afterwards, into our modern times, we don't have that key. We're only guessing. And we get very little of the original meaning. So when you take the first sentences of Genesis and you read about the dark, you read about the form, you read about light and the waters, air and spirit, and so on and so forth, as life gets created and life develops and evolves. We don't know exactly what they're referring to, because it's not only a mistranslation, but it's a condensed version. It's only giving you one line of translation. In other words, one meaning that they can pull from it. They're not writing it in multi-level. You're losing that. You're losing the depth of it. That's why I say it's a partial translation. It's a mistranslation. It's condensed down to like one simplified statement that they can pull from those mysterious, original, ancient language texts. But I can give you a little bit more of the fuller understanding on a few of these passages, because I do believe, from my research and from reflecting on it within and prayer, that every sentence, every passage as it goes through the history of Genesis, it's a prehistory, it's prehistoric, because it's before our time, before the patriarchs, before the prophets. This is before humanity existed as we know it. These are ancient periods of evolution. What I have come to understand is that it's talking about the earth even before it has oceans. It's talking about it when it didn't even have light from the fire within, the heat. Okay, so it's somewhat chronological that you understand how a system is formed and the planets spin off of it. You've got a lot of volcanic activity that happens, and that is in the passage. It's followed by the passage after that. It talks about the waters. So there's water that condenses, precipitates onto the surface where it's kind of boiling. And then you've got water that's up above into the atmosphere. It's thick water with a lot of other material in it. It's a steamy kind of water. And it's spread out because it's expanding. Hot water, heated water, steam vapor. So these are the waters. And there's water above and there's water underneath. And that's followed by a passage about the earth hardening, getting encrusted, so forms the crust of the planet. In tectonic plate theory, that's considered, crust is the landmass, all the rock, all the bedrock, and the layers underneath, all the layers that have formed over such a long time of these processes. It's called continental crust. So all these passages go one after the other in Genesis until you get up to the point where it's primordial humankind. It describes a human form that doesn't have what we know of as male and female. It tells you in this biblical Garden of Eden that there's a race, it's plural, called Adam. And this being, these beings, this species, this race is going to evolve. And they're kind of in slumber. They don't have willpower. They're not doing whatever they want. They just do what they're guided to do by outside force, a superior force that keeps them like that. And they're sleeping. They're sleeping until they get awakened. And it talks about an influence of fallen angels. Because prior to that, the influence is all angels, angelic. And then they're under the command of the leader, the head, highest angel, angelic, like, as they would say, God, that high up, the one, not a group of masses of mortals. It's like an immortal, and this is named Jehovah, or loosely termed Jehovah. I'm thinking that there can be different variations on the name, depending on how you pronounce the language. But it's standard in the modern time, transliterated as Jehovah. Now, this is the ruler that's moving the whole process of the the being that will become mankind. So they're split, the side from each other's side. One side goes to male, one side goes to female. And this is done with the unseen, non-physical force of the beings that are angels, and they're commanded by Jehovah. Now what happens is there's a further evolution that takes place by fallen angels, which are Luciferian. I'm going to get into that into a whole other video, because people get so interested in these things and don't really know. How is that connected with Satan? How is that connected with the devil? How is it a demon? How is it an angel? Well, Luciferian comes about as there was this war on the planet, and a war in the whole universe indeed. But when it came to the planet that we know, way back in the ancient times, the battle was fought. There's a struggle over different philosophy of which way they're going to go. And the losers were the Luciferians. They were the less evolved. But in a way, no one's a total loser, because they continue to exist. And what they needed was physical form to do something for them. But they did not have physical form. Luciferians could not take physical form, but they could contact it. They could have communication with it. So what they did was reach the female side, which was newly created in those days, in those years, you could say. The communication of the Luciferians had the method of entering into the spinal cord. So they weren't in a physical form, but they were like in an electrical form through the nervous system. They worked their way in through the spinal column, like snaking, up into the brain, and causing the women to have imagination about what this was. That was the way the communication was made. It wasn't like speaking with the mouth. It was more like telepathic, but not actually telepathic, because they didn't have a body. So their expression would have to be energy that flowed in through the spine, not necessarily the ears. The ears are probably not even involved, but it gets directly into the brain that way and tells the women about different ways they can evolve. So the women then took it to the man, the males, who were doing something different. It said in a very general form that the women were developing imagination, which is a creative force based on wishes and hopes and based on memory, how they want to formulate something that they desire. On the male side, they were developing in general on the aspect of willpower. That's the force of will, saying, this is what's going to be, like a very proactive, aggressive ability, willpower. And when you combine these, you get the creation of the human race at that time that evolves up into where we are today. But going back to that juncture point, this is very important, because you transition from the way Jehovah intended the human race to be. And then there's this big opening for the Luciferian spirit, the Luciferian beings, the Luciferian fallen angels to come in and evolve and take part in our transformation in a different way, in another way. Now, Jehovah couldn't do anything about this. It's just a different thing. Jehovah couldn't fight them, and Jehovah didn't punish us Jehovah stated the consequences of this. Didn't tell us we couldn't do it. It basically was inevitable. So he only was explaining what would happen as a result of this change. And we would transition. And this is what is talked about in the pain and the suffering of childbirth. Because women and men started to get together on their own, by free will, out of desire, and started to procreate. They hadn't been doing it up until that point. The prior phase, before Jehovah altered the form, in that phase, humans were hermaphroditic or bisexual. They held the ability and the organs to be able to reproduce just with one. They didn't need a mate. So as Jehovah changed it to split humankind into male and female, Luciferians came in and further changed things to their own advantage. And then humankind totally transitioned, going into the modern phase that we have now. Our origin comes from that, because all of our generations go back to then. Our ancestors were the Adam race, along with Eve, what's called Eve as the female side of it. Suffering from the pain and the mistakes of reproducing with not the perfect mate, not at the perfect times of the year, and not giving birth in the perfect way, because all of this knowledge was not embedded into our brains. All this was not wisdom yet. We had to go through a lot of experience of mistakes. We were warned, but it was inevitable that we just have to go through it. So this is a lot of things in Genesis that's not really known when you read the English version. And I'm just giving you a few points out of it, because there's a lot more points if you analyze every passage, you study it, you research, as I have for years, just to be able to say this just off the top of my head. Here's a few things. But if you open up the Bible, just in itself, the present day English Bible, I don't know if you've got the King James, I don't know if you've got the Good News Bible, or the NIV, and whatever. They're terrible. I mean, a lot of those, that's like, yeah, that's good for somebody in first grade to just start out with, but not to finish with it, because you're not getting hardly anything. You have to study it further. You have to read the occult. You have to get mystical. It's no wonder why the non-religious, the non-believer, the atheist, or the agnostic can make fun of the biblical person, the Bible believer, the Christian, or the Jew. It's no wonder why that group can attack anyone who's trying to study the Bible, because they know it's a joke. It's a flawed version. But when you think about how many things I can tell you from my research, it's no longer a joke. They can't make fun of it anymore, because I know how the science is in there. Science before they had science. The science that the atheists use, the materialism of today, the unbeliever, has only been in use for a few hundred years, if even that. Most of it just came about as a result of the 20th century. And how old is the Bible? They already knew that, the people that wrote the Bible, the wise elders. They knew that, but they didn't want you to know. Because if you weren't sincere, if you weren't willing to study it in depth, then you shouldn't know. Because it's just like the message it says in Genesis. It's like a reflection again. They were almost acting as God with the wisdom. G-O-D. Jehovah did the same thing to us in the beginning. You're not going to know things unless you go through it and you study it and you're sincere and you truly want it in your heart, your mind, and your soul. All the way to your spirit. You've got to bring in your higher spirit when you study these things. Thanks for listening, everybody. I didn't know it would go on this long, but really this stuff is so deep. I could do studies and studies upon studies just with this, and it's a monologue. Imagine if it was a conversation and people could ask questions. I mean, we could go all night and day, and you know, it's going to have to happen, because that's why I'm studying this. I'm getting groups together to directly communicate, to study together, to pray together. And it's not just about the ancient stuff. It's not just about the scripture. It's about the future. What are we supposed to do now? What's the new Bible that's being written? What's the new science? Because we have so far to go. There's so many questions. Questions that we've already started answering, but we don't have the full answer. We've got to complete the process. We've got to keep going. We've got to move ahead. We have to continue to get educated, seek knowledge, and become wise. We have to be serious about the divinity that we're connected with. We have to take our lives serious. And it has a lot to do with studying the stuff from the past so we can learn from their mistakes, and we can compare it in a timeline where we were, how we've evolved, how we made a lot of mistakes and got ignorant and got confused from these mistranslations, and how we started having enemies. Oh, they don't believe this, they believe that. And then we've got to know what we really are going to believe and create a new movement, a spiritual awakening, so we can project from a solid foundation of what we do know, what we've learned from everything they've given us in the past. We've got to appreciate that. And then we can continue the species. We can do the glorious thing that we're here to do.